fucking media.
No, I mean, I was going to say, let's talk about some police topic. You pick.
I wonder what's been driving me crazy lately.
Yeah, that's what I was going to... Or some other random topic that's been driving you crazy lately.
Well, the I'm pissed about Obama thing just keeps burning me. Like, I'm so burning about the situation.
With Dapple specifically?
No, in a broader concept of... And it's not that he did it. I mean, he's a corporate Democrat. That's what's expected of him. It's that we praise him and put him on such a pedestal when we know all these things that were bad, and then to be left in the hands of Trump, which isn't going to empirically be different. It's more of the concept that our country and that power we have allowed to fall into such a representation of us as a people. And so much of that for the last 8 years was something that he should have been, if he's so smart, he should have been able to address and create a better government for us in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah. I mean, I'm always wary of the use of comparatives, better, worse, better relative what, and better according to whom, worse relative what, worse according to whom. But you raised an important point, which is that, when Barack Obama ran in the 2008 primary, a lot of people forget that he was running on almost every issue to the right of Hillary Clinton, who was running on pretty much every issue to the right of John Edwards, right? If we wanted the most progressive Democrat who was quote unquote viable, really there were only two viable Democrats in that primary race, but John Edwards got on the stage too. You would have voted for Edwards. And if you wanted your second most liberal choice in that particular race, you would have gone Hillary on the policy proposals. At the time, to give an example, right, Barack Obama was not asserting that we needed a mandate to achieve universal health care. Hillary Clinton's plan included it, and it was one of the arguments that he used that was kind of a free market argument in that primary. People don't buy insurance not because they don't want it, but because they can't afford it. If we make it affordable, they'll purchase it, or mandate is unnecessary, blah, blah, blah. But because Barack Obama is African American, especially those of us who come from sort of liberal bourgeois contexts, we all know that African American means liberal progressive like us. And so we've decided to mediate his presidency on the basis of values he never claimed to possess, and on which he did not campaign on, simply because we're committed to the idea. And again, this is another one of my problems with liberals, that identity is destiny. And so I think this is an interesting maybe opportunity to talk about the problem of identity politics on the left and whether the left leans too heavily on this, especially in light of what has happened in this recent election, where we all said the following identity categories are going to come out in force against Trump. Latinos, women, African Americans, they're all coming out. None of them came. Like, we were 0 for all of them. And that is, I think, a problem in terms of if you're on the left and you think that your policy proposals move the country in a better direction than the alternative, you better be able to read the scene a little better. And clearly we were not, we did not do a good job. And we didn't do a good job precisely because we seem to be so committed to this theory that identity is destiny. And is it a time where we have to sort of make more complex our own anthropology in terms of how we understand other human beings and how they go about making decisions about politics?
Completely. But you're pushing me right now to think, how did this change? Because on the right, that's what I'm saying. Like, I just don't buy that the left and right are different things. So on the right now, the two candidates they had, John Kasich and Rand Paul, were if you went to policies of what most conservatives actually want, it was those two, right? And if it was those two, I wouldn't have been sitting here complaining. Could I have talked to Rand Paul and John Kasich about Dakota Access Pipeline? Easily. But the problem is what you're saying, they don't identify. John Kasich is a little goofy, right? Kind of comes off as like your creepy uncle or something. And then Rand Paul is talking about drugs.
Wait, which creepy uncle?
Yeah, it's the one you didn't mind touching you.
Lawsuit number one.
Like, oh, John. Okay, so moving on. Why would I use John for a Hispanic family? Anyway, moving on. And Rand Paul is talking libertarian, is talking ending the drug war and stuff, and they want to punish those black people, so you can't end the drug war. So they took the identity of what was really closer to them, which was their asshole grandpa who still talks like a racist.
Who is a racist?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know if he is or not, because you never know.
Well, I think that I think the problem with the whole like racist conversation is, when you say somebody is racist, do you mean that they harbor racist rhetoric because of the milieu in which they came up with, or do you mean that they have a sort of systematic worldview in which they have considered a series of issues and concluded that, you know, there are natural biological races and some are inferior and they're right?
I think they feel they're superior because of their group, and that group is the DNA of categorical whiteness or whatever.
But I think the right, because like one of the things that we're having to wrestle with is the fact that there are people who voted for George W. Bush, then voted for Barack Obama, then voted for Trump, right? And some of those people, I'm sure we could find, do and say racist things from time to time. But I think we have to be able to distinguish between people who are simply prejudiced because of their finiteness and the context in which they came up, which frankly is true of all human beings.
But is it...
I can go to any country on earth and find ignorant people who hate other people because of what they look like or where they're from. And I might not have America's particular racial history to sort of pin it on and say, see, race or racism is the central problem of the American narrative.
But prejudging by race is an aspect of...
No, of course.
Of racism.
But my point is that most people who do that don't do that because they sort of read the theory and agreed with it. They simply grew up in a place shaped by a history of speaking in this way. And so I think we have to be able, especially as like highly educated progressives, be able to distinguish between someone who is a product of their environment and how we deal with that person politically and otherwise, versus someone who's like, no, you know, I like read a bunch of pseudoscience and I thought about it for a long time, and I think there has to be a distinction between.
Where's the delineation then? Because the only reason they can't read that information and see its flaws is because of their environment.
No, but I think that's exactly it. I mean, I remember interviewing an activist in this town who is pretty radical, I think, in a lot of his rhetoric, and at one point I asked them, you know, in light of what you've said about like history and structure and all these things, don't we also have to acknowledge that white racists or white people that harbor racist views are also in the same way a product of this sort of history?
Of course.
And he was like, yeah. And he was perfectly willing to say that, despite the fact that he has a fairly sort of radical black nationalist framework in which he operates. And so in light of that, I do think that has to inform how we deal with folks, or how we think about voters, you know, who might do things that turn us off in a lot of ways, but for whom it's not necessarily an ideological commitment, right? Is this person a racist, or is he just like an angry person who speaks the sort of angry language of the context in which they grew up? And especially when you're talking about folks who don't have a ton of education or who aren't super sophisticated, right? Like they might have money, they might not, but in terms of their understanding, their broader understanding of these issues, because inevitably we just end up in the identity politics, and the identity politics don't really help us resolve these questions in terms of even understanding the dynamics that play in people's decision making.
Well, I think I'm guilty of what we're talking about here, so because you could be a racist based upon your whiteness as a race, we don't make a distinction, or we use our words loosely to separate that from whiteness, which is the execution of white supremacy and colonization. Those are concepts that we can show from whiteness, and maybe we should change it to colonization or something like that. Because I think when we say white supremacy, that's easily interpreted and understandably interpreted as something against being white, but it's not. You can be black and execute white supremacy.
Yeah.
We see it all the time. You can be white and fight against white supremacy, which in that concept puts you into the blackness, but there's theoretical blackness and then there's physical blackness. So by definition of theory, I would be fully entrenched in blackness because I try everything I can to fight against colonization and white supremacy. So
because blackness, there's a worldview, right? So it's a theoretical approach to engaging the rest of the world. So you have a series of considerations and historical factors that you use principally to mediate your reality. And that's, I think, an important way to think about this issue, because once you make it in post-colonial thought, there's this idea of the synchronic versus the diachronic, and the way race works as a concept. And the idea is that in colonial rhetoric, the other, whatever that other is always cast in synchronic terms, which is that they never evolve or change over time or history. They're always this one thing, whether it's like the mystical Orient or, the dark African continent. It's always like this thing that's stuck in time and doesn't change and is always primitive in some way, right? Whereas, again, in the colonial context, the view of the European will be diachronic. It's allowed to evolve over time. At one point we were this, and then we were that, and then now we're this. And so, I wonder to what extent sometimes we get on the other side of that stuck into seeing these issues as synchronic, when our basic critique of racism is that very observation that you treat race as this synchronic thing, this thing that traps us in our primitiveness. But we seem to do the same thing with whiteness, and we ignore the fact that what we think of today as a white power structure wasn't always that. And the folks who colonized much of the New World were not people who were in power, right? Like if you read the early documents from, say, the English Crown, right? They're essentially tenant farmer documents. You guys get to go here and mine the land and farm it, and you owe us this a percentage of what you get. And, the word colonist is just a Latin word that means tenant farmer, historically. And so it's true that those persons who came from Europe and were therefore white eventually came to America and imposed their own sort of power structure. And it is white because of that contingent history. But the idea that it's sort of like synchronically white, like America is always like this white supremacist exercise and can be nothing else, ignores the fact that this is something that has emerged and is continuing to emerge in a historical process.
Right. The way, you always bring it out into some philosophical way.
Sorry.
Yeah, I got you. But so in practical application, what has happened is, in traditional verbiage, I would say the property of white supremacy when I say that the second premise of American policing is the protection of white property is really what I would say, looking at it historically. But what I try to say now is white and elite property, because there's an elite aspect to it, because there are other races and stuff that execute and operate within the white supremacy. It's white and elite supremacy. So the problem is if you take away the elite, they will protect the white before everybody else. So that's what I'm trying to say. And I don't have a concise way of presenting that.
No, and look, I think you're absolutely right. And that was one of the things I saw in the Black press, is that my experience of the Black press were institutions that covered Black populations as a business niche, but never sort of thought about what does it mean to be Black in terms of this theoretical framework through which we approach and mediate our understanding of the world. And so, for a lot of years, and it's true that a lot of the Black media institutions in Baltimore are heavily criticized in poor areas for effectively not representing those areas. And it's true, they generally adopt and represent very bourgeois value systems. And in this way sort of promote.
You do know most people are going to have to look up bourgeois.
That's all right.
You're going to make them look it up?
Yeah, no, most of us had to read the Communist Manifesto at some point. So okay. I don't think it's too much to ask for people to look up that word.
All right.
But we can just say elite if people prefer that. I think that they encapsulate, that idea of sort of, especially that upper middle class or professional class elitism that emerges, especially from people who are educated in academic spaces, which is where, in our world, for better or for worse, our knowledge disciplines are. That is where we produce knowledge. Where was I?
It's great for the grapes.
But you're right. In the Black press, I found that because there hadn't been given that much consideration about what it meant to conduct journalism from a framework that accepts as normative the experience of African Americans in America over the course of time, that you ended up with sort of coverage that really didn't, it was essentially white normative journalism in blackface, but it wasn't in any meaningful way, to my mind, black journalism.
Yeah, it's kind of like when you just put a black face on the white institution of what it was. Like, I feel that way
about
on a lot of
Obama's
things.
presidency.
Sure. And so, I mean, it's a good example. And because I put myself in these spaces of blackness.
And let me just problematize what I said, because that it would seem to suggest that there's some sort of like black essence that would then drive a specific conclusion. And I'm not saying that adopting a framework in which you center the African American experience necessarily requires you reach specific conclusions. It's just that you reach the conclusions by considering those factors. Sorry.
So, because I put myself in all these spaces of blackness where I obviously am going to stand out,
yes,
there are times where I am challenged by the black face on white supremacy or white institutions. And I'm like, I can respond to this honestly, but then I'm going to be this white kind of thing checking a person of color on blackness and what it is, or I'm going to sit here and eat this. I don't know what to do.
Yeah, no, but so let me ask you a question, right? Because in those spaces, are you generally in activist spaces or in community spaces?
So community and media. I mean, no, I would say, sorry, activists and media. So yeah, there is a certain thing there from the general population. If you're going to act like that, like in a West Baltimore or something like that, they will almost give me no pushback whatsoever because they're just like, holy shit, it's a unicorn, you know, and they just go about their day. So the only people I get engaging me in any kind of challenging fashion is that, because the mass group that sees me as this unicorn, they just kind of do this weird thing where they stand in awe and we're like, no, that's good progress. And so, well, it's not sufficient progress, so can you help me move it forward? And they kind of have this thing where they just accept it and move on, but we want to be challenged in these things. So it ends up being really media a lot of times where I'll be in black media and it's like, oh, you guys are doing it right now.
No, and see, and again, you know, black press, right? But no, I agree with you. And so I think part of the problem is that a lot of activists of color, and certainly a lot of media professionals of color, are again generally from, if they're not from a different social location in terms of like having been born maybe middle or upper middle class, they have been in those spaces long enough where that is their normative framework. And so they're not, they don't actually speak for the poor black person who lives in a majority black space created through a process of segregation, right? And one of the things I've started to wrestle with, because I'm one of these bourgeois people of color, right? Like I grew up in a Puerto Rican in Massachusetts, where in the northeastern United States, it's impossible to be Puerto Rican and white. Like those things just don't happen. And then I moved to Maryland and everyone says I'm white because people here don't know what a Puerto Rican is. And so it was like this weird thing where like I've watched myself, my racial status transform depending on where I am in the country. But I can't help but notice that race has been a central question for me throughout my academic career and throughout my time in any series of bourgeois spaces, whether that was the legal profession or journalism or, you know, my time doing doctoral and academic work. And I generally centered the question of identity as a person who identified as a person of color who was always navigating ultra-white spaces, because elite spaces, because of our history, are just inevitably white. Whereas the person who lives in McKeldrey Park is never navigating an ultra-white space. And for those who don't know, McKeldrey Park is a neighborhood in East Baltimore. And so for those persons, the question of identity and the question of blackness almost never arises, right? Like it's generally when I'm in those spaces that somebody says to me, Black lives matter, all lives matter, right? I've never heard that from a white person. I've only heard that from black people, right? In terms of my work, I've never had a white person be like, we need more stop and frisk. I've had plenty of black people say that to me. And so, you know, when I'm in those spaces that where blackness isn't a question, you don't have to assert your identity because you're not sort of presented with anything else. You don't get that sort of pushback. You don't get that sort of like, no, you're white, you don't have a voice in this, or, you know, that's not been my experience, right? People are generally, one, they don't necessarily think all the things that the progressive activists think, but they're much more willing to engage you in dialogue and not mediate your right to speak entirely through their perception of your identity. And this, is one of the things I wonder whether that whole question of what is a white norm or what is a white voice is sometimes a projection of persons of color like me who are inevitably in white spaces. And so we have a chip on our shoulder about it, and we make the entire racial narrative of our country about the fact that, like, my advisor didn't like my paper, and he didn't accept these, whatever. Like, but you get my point.
I mean, so what I'm concerned with, though, is I think the activists are like that far left push. So they may be over the edge, but that's what you need to get the other person to understand that when you're in that moderate black space of the church or something, and they're giving you a voice, that you don't overstep your place and speak over the community like you can when you come in as a white savior or something like that. Yeah. So while they push them to a place that is more of balance and where they should be, even though that far left may not be where people would actually want to be. But those general members of society, period, that are stuck watching that TV, and the only media they get are Fox and CNN and MSNBC and the Baltimore Sun, are all going to end up in that same thought mentality of general white America, because they're being fed those same lines. They'll say all lives matter because they're thinking the same thing that most white people are thinking. Like, what do you mean? That's crazy. And because they just aren't sitting there thinking and learning enough to say, well, it's Black Lives Matter too. And the point is that if you make Black Lives Matter, then you will have systems and policies in place which support all lives mattering. But you have to start at who is oppressed and marginalized the most, as that's how you identify what right is for everyone. And if you explain it to them, they go, oh, wow, that makes sense.
I certainly have had that experience where I said, well, I think the reason they say this is this, and people are like, okay. But at the same time, I've also had a lot of conversations, especially with younger African Americans. And generally, it's not to say that younger African American women don't also often harbor similar ideas. I just happen to have had more of these conversations with young African American men, but a lot of them don't really want to talk about race. They don't necessarily want to centralize race. They might prefer to talk about class, or they might just want to talk about the policy issue and not mediating it through these other things. And while they might understand the history of how we got to this point and how race has shaped it, they don't all necessarily centralize that in their narrative about how we are supposed to progress or where we have been. And in light of that, I think as someone who, because of my education and because of my social location, has the capacity to drown out voices like theirs, if what I'm saying is that I'm a racial justice activist, then at some point I have to acknowledge that the people that I claim to understand so well have a very different worldview than mine, and that I silence them if I say, well, it's because they don't know this, that, or the third. It's like, well, maybe they do. Maybe they just don't agree with that. They didn't reach my conclusion that I got, reached after my advisor wouldn't let me write the paper I wanted to on,
Well, talking to people is always weird.
Sure.
I have to caveat every thought I have when I ask somebody something to get their input, because that's only from their perspective,
of course, from
their lack of information and what they're willing to actually tell you and understand about themselves. So when I think that the dope boy on the corner doesn't want to address race, I think it's because he's a proud male and he doesn't want to use that as an excuse for why he can't succeed. Because I'm thinking that when people push me about policing and I have these what seem to be rational answers of why I did the things I did in policing, when you say it, it sounds like nothing but a gross excuse.
Yeah, but what's interesting is that my experience is that people involved in street economies are probably more likely to assert the racial narrative than people who are from same spaces but not involved in those things. And so, just to give an example of something that has...
You mean people that can cross the spaces don't want to address it?
Or who don't centralize it in the same way, okay. Right? So, like to give an example, right? Like I remember interviewing a guy. He's part of like a crew that runs an open air drug market, and he's talking about police harassment, and he feels like they're harassing me because I'm black. And part of me is like, yeah, but they know you because you run this open air drug market. In my head, I'm thinking like maybe, I mean, obviously, like the race will explain the sort of trajectory that landed you here, but it doesn't necessarily explain why that cop harassed you on that instance.
I think I could articulate that. The question would be, could he?
No, I mean,
right. So does he understand that picture as I see it? Because the way I see it is he's in a red line community that doesn't have resources, that were intentionally set up that way, that the police are in that area and all those things. And why? Because he's black. No, right? So those things are right in a big umbrella looking down.
So that's why I say from a structural sort of historical narrative, that is totally right. But the reason the police are harassing him is because some other person in the project called and complained, right? Because I've seen that.
But because he's black. Like all those things are intricately linked, because we always have to remember that there is more drug dealing and more drugs in the white neighborhood. So I bought drugs on corners and from friends in Edgewood and Bel Air, and nothing ever happened.
Sure. I mean, what makes the historical streams inform how the situation became what it was. But, that specific interaction is more complicated, right? Because the cop is equally sort of shaped and his job looks the way it does, not because he entered the academy at 19 and like decided this is how he was going to police. He has a job to do, right? And, the community person who is calling that officer is also probably an African-American in the context of Baltimore, and is, concerned about either safety or property or whatever it is. And that cop is certainly, if that person calling does not want to hear from that cop, yeah, but you see, you got to understand that in, the history of structure, that's why they're out there and they don't have any other way to make a living. They're like, I can't walk through my courtyard, and I've seen this. And it's simply to say, like, the more I sort of like spend time in the context, the more I have to sort of complicate what I thought I knew about it.
But that caller is buying into the narrative, too, that calling 911 and sending violence is the answer to her fear of violence.
No,
right?
That's fair. That's fair.
That's also been shaped.
But the problem is, like, we did the zombie story episode, right? And what you described seeing at the end of that episode is this ghastly, terrible thing that some human beings did to another human being. And when you live in a city that has almost the same number of homicides in absolute terms as a city like New York, that
have more than New York. What are you talking about?
Per capita.
We have more, period. The lowest in New York was 174 not too long ago.
No, I just referred to last year.
But think about that. Crazy. They were down to 174.
I know, so exactly. So if you're somebody who's living in a city where that's going on, and you can appreciate fully that this history of structural racism explains how we got here, but you live in that community, your concern is also that, I don't want to be another one of these numbers. And look, the simple truth is, Commissioner Davis said this at a press conference, like 288 out of 311 people who were or 318 people who were killed in Baltimore were people with 7 or more convictions on their record, which is simply to say, like, they were people who were involved in the streets.
This is empirically true. Kevin Davis actually said something that's true for once. There is no statistical relevance between being killed in Baltimore by a gunshot than being killed in Podunk, Iowa.
No, and so my point is, like, a lot of violence that you might experience in a community like this, if you're not involved in the street life, is probably sort of wrong place, wrong time. But if you're a community member, you don't want to take that risk with your life. And so, but you're certainly not calling the police because that guy is black. And, once the police now know you and they know you're part of this operation, they're going to harass you probably more often than not, right? Like, if I don't know, like when you were a police officer, people that you knew.
Do regular black population also view like black males as being bigger and stronger and older? Like, is that I thought that was race mutual, right?
I'm not actually sure.
So if they were intimidated, like, you can be black calling on an unreasonable fear of blackness.
Sure, I mean,
like, I think that's been proven out.
I mean, I think that's certainly possible. But in these communities,
Yeah,
Baltimore's
because if
not
I was on the corner and I was doing the same actions, would they call the police on me? Because the thing is being a cop, answering those patrol calls, I'm going to tell you at least 50% of the time that people call for drug dealers on the corner, those people aren't drug dealers. They're just people on the damn corner.
Sure, yeah,
like
yeah.
I'll go by and I know them. Like they're not drug dealers. So we get a thing in our book in our mind saying that this is a drug dealer, and that resident will continue to think that that's a drug dealer, and that's not. That's a dude who stands on the corner for 30 minutes every morning while he waits for his Uber and shoots his shit with his buddies. I know that.
Sure, yeah. I mean, in the context that I have in my mind, especially the sort of specific place, they're clearly. I don't think there's any debate about what these particular guys.
If you're on Pennsylvania Avenue or something,
I mean, there's certain places like.
Right.
Like when the entire courtyard is kind of running like this, and you guys only ever hang out here, right? Like we're not just talking about like some guy who like walks down the street. And I've watched. There are people who are living in these courtyards in the buildings that surround it, and it's weird. And you can tell they have this look on their faces as they're walking through because they're just kind of like going about their regular lives, and there's all this activity going on. And it's just to say that you have to sort of problematize the overall narrative, right? Like that interaction with a police officer is certainly informed by our history of race and structural racism, but it's also informed by the fact that you're engaged in this activity that, for better or worse, whatever we think, is illegal. And
largely being engaged in that activity is a...
I know, but again, if that community resident calls the police and says, I don't feel safe, go do something, are they supposed? What is the response? What and at what point is?
It's difficult. Well, the response can't be violence.
Yeah. I'm not saying that.
But she's calling for violence. We're answering with violence. So our whole system is like we're asking questions about a system that we shouldn't be asking questions about, because the questions should always be, what is the new system?
So maybe the question is, and this is, we've gone about 33 minutes. So
we always do this.
I know, but. Do you think that one of the ways we might transform policing is if we did something like in England, right, where police officers are not generally armed with firearms, but there are special units. Now, obviously, we have a very different gun culture in America that makes that much harder.
It has to go backwards here, and that's a hard pill to swallow.
So do you how do we make policing less violent? Because I do think that we tend to think about policing as like our own personal ass kickers, right? Like, I don't want to get in that guy's face. I want this cop to get in that guy's face.
We're classifying what policing is. And so to be policing, I will tell you that it's violence, right?
Okay.
My response is violence when you are policed. It's necessary, right? Because I'm telling you, I'm ordering you, I'm instructing you, I'm taking something away from you. So look, I enjoyed the violent aspect of policing, and I will never shy away from that, because if you start quizzing me on why I did it, it's always going to come back to because I had fun. And that's a bad thing to admit, but we have to do it and move past that.
Sure, yeah.
Right. So while I was having fun in those environments, it's because all those things came together, and our answer was violence. But there are times when you're going after the murder suspect and you're going after the rapist where you want me, right? But you don't want me handling your domestic violence. You don't want me writing you a parking ticket. You might not want me being the one that pulls you over on a car stop. Like, car stops are super safe statistically. So there's like, it's more dangerous to be a taxi cab driver. We all know this. So a civilian could easily handle car stops. If the person ran away, so what? Right? Like, you just document it, and we'll follow up with an investigation later and figure out what happened. But you should only use people like me for those specific instances where violence is what you need to make the rest of community safe for a short window of something. Right. So
let me ask, because you mentioned when it's a rapist, when it's a murder, right? So what then is the line? Are there only certain types of crime that we would say it's valid to call the police for if they're nonviolent?
No. It's who we send. Like, that's the problem, is our response. We are the ones in power. So if someone calls because there's people on their corner, well, maybe a community representative is somebody we can forward that call to, who we know and trust, and they can go out and talk to those boys and maybe send it up to an escalation chain if nobody does something. There's a whole bunch of ways to think about doing that. But clearly, putting the gun, which, remember, a presence of a gun always makes every situation more dangerous. So the minute you asked the police officer to be there, you empirically made your life at risk.
Definitely.
Right? So we are saying that we're going to put at risk those 5 boys on the corner because we were curious about what they were doing. And I don't think that's moral, let alone rational. And if we want to bring costs down, then we need to think about how we're going to do that. Cops should be extremely well trained and should be expensive as hell, right? So, I mean, my view of a cop should be somebody that has at least a master's degree, probably had 6 to 8 years in federal training, and can actually be what we expect that person to be. One reason why I was good at it is because I had a degree and because I went to the Marine Corps and had that discipline and had that training. So if you could take that and make it 4 or 5 times more, by the time you put a cop onto the street, they would be rare. They would know how to handle situations. They wouldn't be flooded being constantly involved in situations. And you would be able to use community members, people with public health professionals. Like, what's better for a person doing drugs in the corner? A public health professional to respond and help them, or a cop with a gun? I mean, these things really should be quite logical.
So let me ask in that case, because it's, in some ways what you're saying is that we want police who are able to handle situations not simply through violence.
But I wouldn't call them police. I mean, is that police?
So that's my question. Are we still talking about creating a police force?
Because policing is violent. So I would think that falls. I think that can be totally separate. I think that with the current system in our society, I bring that under the umbrella of policing, the police department, so we can all accept it and make it palatable and say that we still have this big, huge police department. But I really want a vast majority of that police department to not be police officers, to be something else that responds to those things. And cops are only for emergencies, almost like a SWAT team. Like, why?
Yeah, that's what I was kind of thinking.
Noticed,
yeah.
Right?
All right, we just solved policing.
Damn, that was easy.
It's easy.
It's always been easy. The problem
Less than
is
40
how do we
minutes.
get anybody to do it? Miss Pugh? Hello? Miss Pugh?
But if we do that, how will cops kill people? I don't. Yes,
Don't understand.
yeah, that's the problem.
Like, what are they going for in all those things? We're supposed to be cutting this off again, but I often wonder, like, when you look at the model, and I'm trying to tell you, we have data from all over the literature telling us that there's different ways to approach this, which will be much safer. We have about 130 some other developed countries which are pretty much doing it better than us in all aspects. We have 1,000 different places to look for better answers. What are we stuck here for?
I'll tell you why. To my mind, because they have the same sort of community member that I was referring to earlier in the conversation, who also calls their office and says, I feel unsafe, and I expect you to do something about it. And that there's a good chance that if that community person is calling your office, they also vote. And in this city, making sure somebody votes for you so you can keep your, like, one of the few cushy jobs that actually exist in this space, I think the political considerations drive why we never reach reform, because there are inevitably a lot of people in those communities, who frankly, they don't have the educational background, the sophistication to sort of like appreciate all the arcs. All they know is that it's the 4th time my car's been broken into and you better do something about it, or I'm going to vote for the person who says they're going to do something about it. And I think that's why we talk a lot about reform in Baltimore, but reform never actually comes, because it doesn't help that often the same people talking about reform are also the same people going like, these are the drug dealers in the neighborhood and you need to target them. And it's like, yeah, so which one did you want again? Is it reform or is it bust heads? Because you seem to be asking for both here. And sometimes
they ask for both for sure.
Yeah.
I think the commissioner loves to use that as an excuse, as most of them do.
Sure.
But they want the action. So the problem, they have the right goals. It's just fundamentally the police and government and people with power to understand that the solutions to not having somebody break into that car aren't rooted in prison. Yeah. That's actually the recipe for your car being broken into.
I mean, this goes back to the issue is some of us view policing as a question. Do we need policing? And what should it look like if we conclude that we do? And other people view it as the answer. The answer is always policing. And, this is the problem with criminal justice and why I think it's a pseudoscience, right? Criminology. Because any science that knows the answer before it's even started to investigate anything, right? Because the answer is always more policing. The answer is always more police. There's never, you never talk to like a prominent criminologist and he goes, we need less police on the streets. It's always like, we need. So you already knew the answer before you even started, right? And this is a problem that has affected a lot of realms of criminal justice, forensic science, for example, which is science in name only. And I think this is a big part of the problem in our politics, is that as long as some of us view policing as the answer, not as a question, we are always going to have the knock your head in style of policing.
What I'm trying to say about this system, it does both, right? So that's what I'm able to do. I'm able to keep it under umbrella. So the answer is still a police department badge and police department authority. It's just not the violent enforcement wing of it all the time.
Yeah, but it'll never work because it might work.
I know. That's my frustration, right? They're like, oh, this sounds great. I can't see any flaws into it. Okay, see you in 10 years.
Yeah.